Approximately 20 years ago, Formula 1 gave up smoking and ended up, ironically, damaging its health. As attitudes to smoking changed, so did the advertising, in that there wasn't going to be any anymore. But it wasn't a new thing. For the German, British and French Grand Prix, teams were forbidden from having the logos of the tobacco companies that pumped the money into them on their cars. Marlboro would switch to the barcode on the Ferraris, West took the logos off entirely for those races or ran with Mika and David on the cars, Rothmans on the Williams went with Racing or the question mark depending on the laws, Jordan with Bitten and Hisses, Be On Edge, Buzzin' Hornets and so on. The F1 games from the time ended up either using the British Grand Prix or French Grand Prix liveries because that's where the laws were the strictest. It's also interesting because around the British Grand Prix of 1998 there was a Marlboro F1 banner somewhere on the circuit. I think it was in between Stowe and Club, which seems weird because you're not allowed to have the logos on the cars, but you can have this massive billboard. And we'll deal with the hypocrisy of stuff like that a little bit later on. But the teams, at least at the time, loved the tobacco money. Yes, there was an ethical thing to it because even back then we all knew smoking was bad and it was addictive and expensive and the companies were profiting off that addiction, but it meant that the teams were able to survive on the tobacco money because it was almost a bottomless pit of cash. Eddie Jordan was massively relieved to get the Benson and Hedges backing in 1996, and without that money he probably would never have been able to sign Damon Hill for 1998. And I hope Eddie is doing alright given the recent news about his diagnosis. But like I said, it's all gone now. Teams are reduced to being sponsored by vape companies, which is totally legal because they're classed as stop smoking aids, I think. But recently the teams have also hopped on the blockchain and crypto bandwagon, with Mercedes probably wondering what the hell happened when FTX turned out to be a massive scam. But the point remains that the teams have never been able to replace that tobacco money. I always thought that gambling and online casinos would take over, but they haven't, because of the absolute grip they have on sports like football, horse racing, darts and snooker. Alcohol sponsorship hasn't really been a big thing either. I mean, yes, there was the Martini Williams cars, the Jack Daniels V8 supercars, a couple of other things like a Budweiser NASCAR car, but it seems that alcohol advertising has gone the same way as tobacco advertising. So where else do the teams look? Because, well, they need the money to go racing, don't they? There was a lot of PR drummed up last season for British GT when Enduro Racing announced a partnership with OnlyFans, which I believe is like Patreon. Yeah, it's exactly like Patreon in every single way. It's like Patreon in every shape, form or description. Okay, it's not strictly like that, but unlike Patreon, you're allowed to do certain stuff on it. We'll leave it at that. If I crack a few more jokes about it, then it will tick off one of the YouTube advertising tick boxes, but anyway, there was a lot of talk about it, because everybody found it absolutely hilarious. At the same time, Renee Gracie, a racing driver turned OnlyFans professional, returned to the Australian GT grid in an OnlyFans branded Audi. But before OnlyFans and stuff like that, there was Durex, a sponsorship deal with a small team in Formula 1 in the 1970s that got Formula 1 taken off the air. So the 1970s, very much a different time. Thanks in part to Colin Chapman, the teams were turned from running in the colours of the country they represented into 180-mile-an-hour advertising hoardings. Gold Leaf, Marlboro, Gitane and other brands plastered all over them because it meant that the teams could reap the rewards of all that money, and it meant that more prize money was available to go to the drivers. Niki Lauda is said to be the first to really take advantage of this. Jackie Stewart might have got the ball rolling a bit with his association with Ford and Rolex, but Lauda got mega rich off it. At the same time, there were drivers who had started their own teams. Bruce McLaren and Jack Brabham started two very long-standing teams, of which only McLaren is still running, but another world champion who started his own team, well, I say that, Bruce McLaren never won the championship, but he probably should have done, was John Surtees. John Surtees is a man who should be mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Mario Andretti and Jim Clark as an all-round racing icon, because he is the only man to win the Formula 1 and Motorcycle World Championship, now called MotoGP. He's won on 2 and 4 wheels. Not many, if any, have done that, and they've certainly not won both World Championships. Surtees had entered his new team into the 1970 South African Grand Prix, but was using old McLarens because of the delays in getting his own car built. A BP-coloured Surtees-designed car turned up for the British Grand Prix in 1970, and it scored points at the Canadian Grand Prix with John at the wheel. The following year, the team expanded into 2 cars, with a third being entered for Mike Hailwood, who, like Surtees, was a motorcycle champion. The problem was, Surtees, despite his namesake's success and profile, struggled with money. Drivers like Andrea de Adamich and Tim's safety car Schenken brought money, but the team would often struggle, with Hailwood getting a podium at the 1972 Italian Grand Prix, the first year after Surtees retired. In doing so, Surtees, the team, not the bloke, finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship. But because of money being tight, the team was mostly a revolving door of drivers. For the 1973 season, Schenken was out and replaced by Carlos Pache, and they managed to get a podium and 4th place. But points were still hard to come by, even with those 2 good results. Hailwood then left for McLaren at the end of 1973 and was replaced by Jochen Mass, only for Pache to leave the team in mid-1974 and be replaced by Derek Bell, who could barely qualify the car. But the season was punctuated by the death of Helmut Koenig at Watkins Glen, 1 year to the day after Francois Sever was killed at the same track in similar circumstances. 1975 was a complete write-off as they scaled back to a 1-car operation for John Watson, but in 1976 they were offered a lifeline with a highly controversial sponsorship deal. At least it was controversial at the time. Surtees had landed a big money deal with the London rubber company that produced Durex. Now today, that sounds absolutely hilarious, and I'm sure you're laughing to yourselves at home because lol, Durex. Anytime a picture of the Durex Surtees is posted, people have a good chuckle because, once again, condoms are funny. And we all knew one guy at school who could put one over his head and inflate it with his nose because it's funny. And we haven't even got into the other part about Durex being written on the driver's helmets. Grow up, Aiden. We're so used to it these days. I lived in the tail end of the 1990s when car crash TV was a thing, particularly with the World Wrestling Federation, as was, being in its Attitude Era. This era of professional wrestling where the colourful characters like Doink the Clown, Hulk Hogan, the Rockers and so on were replaced with characters who were a lot more raw, no pun intended. Out were the colourful creations, and in were the likes of Kane, the Big Boss Man, D-Generation X and Stone Cold Steve Austin, the latter of which went around beating up his boss every week and did the very thing that every bloke in his early 20s wanted to do. Brick walls, burning oil barrows, a darker tone all round. And on top of the WWE, as it is called now, you had things like Jerry Springer, the world's scariest police chases, Don't Try This at Home, Robot Wars. The colourful Puritan hangover from the 80s was gone, and we entered this world of sex and violence on TV. If you were to show WWE or play the Marshall Mathers LP to somebody in Britain or America in the 1970s, they'd probably have a heart attack. Moral standards were different, and so were sensitivities, and attitudes to on-TV advertising were completely different to how they are now. There are adverts on television today that would never have made it onto television back then, simply because the attitudes of the time would not have allowed it, and people would have been quite offended by it. But at the same time, there was a bit of hypocrisy surrounding all of this because of how advertising works in this country and how it worked before. The BBC is a public-funded organisation. Some today often wonder if the model is fit for purpose in the modern era because we have stuff that is so easily accessible for free. The TV licence is still a thing, but it's not a licence in the same way that you would have a licence to drive. It's a tax, and how they go about enforcing that tax is for another channel at another time. So, because this thing is publicly funded, somewhat reluctantly by the British people, there are no adverts on BBC television. So in between the latest episode of Pointless and the 6 o'clock news, there's no adverts. In the middle of the latest gripping episode of Peaky Blinders, no adverts. And if there is a mention of a brand name on the BBC, it's usually followed with other brands are available to make sure that there is some impartiality. Sellotape is called sticky tape. It's not a Hoover, it's a vacuum cleaner. They use the term modelling clay instead of plasticine. The list goes on. And this next fun fact goes out mainly to the American audience. On British commercial TV, so we're talking ITV, ITV2, ITV3, Channel 4, Channel 5, Dave, and so on, these commercial TV stations are only allowed 12 minutes of advertising per hour. And those 12 minutes are heavily regulated. So when the sponsors appeared on Formula One cars and Formula One slowly made its way onto BBC television in the 1970s, there was a reluctance to put it on because the cars were covered in these brand names, and showing the cars at the front might be showing bias or preference to the brands on those cars rather than the brands that were on the cars at the back of the field, if you follow me. Televised football matches were not allowed to show shirt sponsors, which is a thing that started happening just after this time period until 1983. But it wasn't just the BBC, because ITV had issues with this as well. Unlike the BBC, ITV has adverts. Those of us that watched Formula One during the period 1997 to 2008 will have put up with them putting in adverts, sometimes in the most ridiculous of places. But ITV's issues with advertising on the cars started before all of this, when Colin Chapman brought his original Gold Leaf Lotus 49s to the Race of Champions at Brands Hatch in 1968. There was a big argument between Chapman and the broadcasters, because there were companies that had paid to advertise in those designated advert breaks, and they'd also paid big money to get those ads on primetime TV. And here was Chapman advertising for free. Well, Gold Leaf had paid Chapman rather than ITV to display these logos, so there would have been potentially some rather unhappy advertisers. Why should they pay ITV when Imperial Tobacco didn't? It also didn't help that tobacco advertising had been illegal in Britain since 1963, so when they were showing like the Monaco Grand Prix or the Italian Grand Prix where these logos were still legal to be displayed, it was technically breaking UK law. But either way, ITV and the BBC just reluctantly went along with it. And again, there was a little bit of hypocrisy there, because things like football, the snooker, the Olympics, Wimbledon, Tour de France, any of these other events had advertising hoardings around the pitch or the court or whatever it was they were doing. So they just went, yeah, all right then, we'll just go along with it. But for some reason, this Durex sponsorship kicked everything off in a huge way. It made people at the top of ITV and the BBC very angry. The BBC was supposed to broadcast the 1976 Race of Champions from Brands Hatch, with the instantly recognisable Murray Walker on the mic. Murray wrote in his autobiography that he travelled down to Kent to get set up for the race, when producer Ricky Tilling came over to him and said, "OK Murray, we'll let you know whether you'll be on the air at around 11 AM, if that's alright." And Murray said, "Ricky, what are you on about?" And the response was quite simple: Durex. If Surtees doesn't take those logos off, we're not broadcasting. Cigarettes, which are addictive and can kill you younger if you smoke too many of them, are perfectly fine to display on television. But condoms? No. We can't have sex stuff on the TV now, can we? But then again, I am looking at this with 2024 eyes. Things were completely different back then. Surtees held firm and refused to take the logos off his cars, so the BBC packed up and went home. Like already mentioned, the BBC and ITV were already walking a very tight rope with what was going on in regards to the advertising that, in the case of the BBC, was against their broadcasting code, and ITV in that they weren't seeing a penny of the money that had been spent to advertise on the cars. And Surtees wasn't particularly worried, nor was he particularly upset. The way he saw it, he hadn't done anything wrong. It's not like he'd received a substantial amount of money, which this Durex sponsorship was, to have some absolutely horrendous political slogans plastered all over the car, or have something else utterly offensive written on it. It was a product that is pretty useful, all things considered. Most adults have bought them at one point or another, or in the case of my university, handed out like sweets at the Freshers' Fair. It gave Surtees a second chance at existing. Without this money, they would have had to have closed up their shop, and they would have gone bankrupt without this money. So there was nothing illegal about it, there was nothing sleazy about it, but for whatever reason, the higher-ups at the BBC and ITV just found the whole thing to be too far. And because of this, ITV and the BBC would not broadcast Formula One at all during 1976. The BBC simply said that they didn't think these logos fit with family-friendly viewing. I guess they didn't want kids going, "Daddy, what's a Durex?" and causing a lad and dad to have an uncomfortable conversation too early. But it's not the only time the BBC would do this, because as I've mentioned in a previous video, there was an early episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that wasn't shown in full on the BBC, because of a rather graphic scene that has a man's head explode and then some parasitic creature bursts out of his belly. That was an episode where they set the phasers to nope. When that episode first aired here in 1991 on the BBC, it was shown at tea time, So the scene where Lieutenant Commander Drexler's head explodes was cut, along with several other moments from that episode. That scene was not shown in full on the BBC until into the 2000s, although I think Sky showed it in full before that. Remember, up until the early 2000s, when digital television allowed for more channels to be fit into the frequency band, most people in the UK only had access to 4 or 5 free-to-air channels, so things had to be slightly more regulated than they probably would be now, because they had to find something for everybody. In 1976 there were 3 channels: BBC One, BBC Two and ITV. Channel 4 came around in about 1982, and then Channel 5 in about 1998-1999. Now, with the advent of digital TV, we have something called Freeview, which gives us about 70 channels or so, and there's all on any of them. But the BBC and ITV taking exception to the Durex sponsorship meant that it wasn't just the non-championship race of champions that didn't make the air. The British Grand Prix or any of the other races that they would have shown that year as part of the World Championship were taken off the air. The British Grand Prix was often shown live, as were the Italian, German and Monaco Grand Prix, but because of the Durex sponsorship on the Surtees car, the only bits of the British Grand Prix that the public got to see was what ITV had put in their broadcast of World of Sport the following week. So what made the BBC and ITV change their minds? Well, James Hunt made them change their minds, who, ironically, was probably one of Durex's biggest customers. The 1976 Formula 1 season grabbed the British public in a way that hadn't been seen before. Without going into too much, the UK wasn't a particularly happy place at the time, and James Hunt gave the country a much needed lift with his charm and wit, and was the epitome of women wanted him and men wanted to be him. A record-breaking crowd had turned up to that British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch in the stifling heat, and the crowds chanted "We want Hunt" as the stewards prevented James from taking the restart, only to disqualify him after the fact later on. With Lauda having his accident at the Nürburgring and Hunt closing the gap to just 3 points come the season finale at Fuji, with growing public interest in Hunt and Formula 1, the BBC and ITV had to have a bit of a rethink with regards to their outrage. ITV had started thinking about coming down off its high horse, so the BBC had to kind of do what ITV was doing. ITV had shown highlights of the Canadian and US Grand Prix, and with the title coming to a showdown in Fuji, both networks had to allow the people to see it. For the first time that year, people were allowed to watch the championship battle, which Hunt only just won. Surtees said back in 2016, "It was purely a question of the BBC making their decision. From the point of view of the sport, I was very unhappy. It was very important for the sport to be able to give a good platform for people to support it. It didn't make me happy that the BBC took that position. I thought it was ill-advised considering so many government agencies were out there pushing these products." Meanwhile, Jonathan Martin, who was the producer for Sports Night on the BBC, said, "With hindsight, it was a fairly provocative thing to do. He was within his rights to do it, just as the broadcasters were within their rights. I think it pushed the broadcasters to the limit because F1 already had special dispensation compared with many, many other sports." And thanks to the BBC and ITV reconsidering their position on the whole thing, Jonathan Martin was able to convince the BBC to start airing more Formula 1 Grand Prix starting in 1978. For this, the Grand Prix programme was created, and the rest, they say, is history. But the thing is, with this sponsorship, Surtees ended up having an okay season. Alan Jones, who drove the car that year, managed to finish 5th at Zolder and Brands Hatch, and was 4th in the pouring rain at Fuji. They scored 7 points and finished 10th in the Constructors, which was pretty good for an underfunded privateer in those days. After the season finished, Jones headed for the Shadow team, and Surtees was forced to return to a one-car operation in 1977 with Vittorio Brambilla behind the wheel, and once again they scored 3 points paying positions. But at the end of the 1978 season, they were forced to call it quits. But out of it we get this wow moment. People still talk about this car today, and those who don't know it happened are always entertained by it when they first see it. But it was a massive hypocrisy moment. Marlboro cigarettes were fine on TV, but ew, sex! Something that causes cancer and early death? I sleep. A product that prevents STIs and unwanted pregnancies? Take it off! Won't somebody think of the children? All that stuff about something that is completely normal, at least we think it's completely normal today. So many of us have walked into a shop and bought those things. But then again, this is the same generation that complained about Monty Python, and we're the soft ones. So then, a look at the highly controversial sponsorship of the 1976 Surtees car. And it would have been hilarious if they got someone called Johnny to drive it, wouldn't it? If this has been the fun look through the history books, then do like this video so I know I did a good job. And for more from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here, then a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.